Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Wild Mind, a field guide to the human psyche, by Bill Plotkin, Ph.D., narrated by Brion. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type Wild Mind into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code HUMAN, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures and tables referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Nature is an incomparable guide if you know how to follow her. She is like the needle of a compass pointing to the north, which is most useful when you know how to navigate. C.G. Jung. Sometimes I look out at everything growing so wild and faithfully beneath the sky and wonder why we are the one terrible part of creation privileged to refuse our flowering. David White, From the Sun. Introduction. Revisioning ourselves. Let the day grow on you upward through your feet, the vegetal knuckles, to your knees of stone, until by evening you are a black tree. Feel with evening the swifts thicken your hair, the new moon rising out of your forehead, and the moonlit veins of silver running from your armpits like rivulets under white leaves. Sleep as ants cross over your eyelids. You have never possessed anything as deeply as this. This is all you have owned from the first outcry through forever. You can never be dispossessed. Derek Walcott, Earth. It's time to take another look at ourselves, to re-enliven our sense of what it is to be human, to breathe new life into ancient intuitions of who we are, and to learn again to celebrate, as we once did, our instinctive affinity with the Earth community in which we're rooted. We're called now to rediscover what it means to be human beings in a wildly diverse world of feathered, furred, and scaled fellow creatures, flowers and forests, mountains, rivers, and oceans, wind, rain, and snow, sun and moon. It's time to take an ecological and holistic look at the human psyche, to make a fresh start with Western psychology. In an era when the revealed interdependency of all things is radically reshaping every field of knowledge, what might we discover about the human psyche, the totality of our psychological capacities, both conscious and unconscious, when we consider that we too are expressions of nature's qualities, patterns, and motifs? We're being summoned by the world itself to make many urgent changes to the human project. But most central is a fundamental revisioning and reshaping of ourselves, a shift in consciousness. We must reclaim and embody our original wholeness, our indigenous human nature granted to us by nature itself. And the key to reclaiming our original wholeness is not merely to suppress psychological symptoms, recover from addictions and trauma, manage stress, or refurbish dysfunctional relationships, but rather to fully flesh out our multifaceted wild psyches, committing ourselves to the largest story we're capable of living, serving something bigger than ourselves. We must dare again to dream the impossible and to romance the world, to feel and honor our kinship with all species and habitats, to embrace the troubling wisdom of paradox, and to shape ourselves into visionaries with the artistry to revitalize our enchanted and endangered world. Becoming fully human. Emerging in the late 19th century, Western psychology was seated in that era's prevailing practice and philosophy of medicine. Psychology's focus was on diagnosis and treatment of symptoms, diseases, and mental illness. It was, and in many ways still is, an attempt to identify what could and does go wrong with the human psyche when scrutinized outside its cultural and ecological contexts. Neuroses, psychoses, personality and attachment disorders, manias, depressions, obsessions, and addictions. With few exceptions, such as Carl Jung's analytical psychology, James Hillman's archetypal revisioning of psychology, and the new field of positive psychology, there's been too little consideration of what is inherently right and inspiring about human beings. There's been insufficient tending to the process of becoming fully human, an active, deeply imaginative, contributing member of what cultural ecologist David Abram calls the more-than-human world. A world that includes human society as a subset of a much more extensive Earth community. Western psychology's established ways of understanding ourselves have unintentionally cramped our abilities to grow whole, and to fully mature. The agenda of mainstream psychotherapy has been, from its beginnings, remarkably limited and consequently limiting. What if, for example, our primary human need and opportunity is not to endlessly attend to our emotional wounds and the eradication of perceived psychological disorders, but rather to fathom and flesh out our natural human wholeness and to embody this integral bounty as a gift to others and our world? Conventional Western psychology has focused on pathology rather than possibility and participation, and this renders it incomplete and in many ways obsolete. In Western culture, we've enclosed ourselves within continually mended fences of excessive safety, false security, and shallow notions of happiness, when all the while the world has been inviting us to stride through the unlocked gate and break free into realms of greater promise and possibilities. Our psychotherapy-fashioned fences have affirmed our flaws and failures and corralled us within psychosocial prisons of our own making. Our mainstream educational and religious institutions likewise have suppressed our human potential and magnificence, or at least failed to evoke and foster our brilliance and virtuosity, our capacity to truly mature and to help make our world a better place. Our innate human resources. Our human psyches possess as capacities a variety of astonishing resources about which mainstream Western psychology has little to say. By uncovering and reclaiming these innate resources, shared by all of us by simple virtue of our human nature, we can more easily understand and resolve our intrapsychic and interpersonal difficulties as they arise. We need not be as dependent as we have been on the psychological, social, and professional resources of others, clergy and counselors, family and friends, psychotherapists and psychiatrists, or on the neurological reconfiguration services of psychopharmacological chemicals, whether prescribed or elective. The alleviation of personal troubles is of course important to all of us, but the significance and relevance of our innate psychological resources, largely unrecognized, unvalued, and uninventoried by Western psychology and culture, go well beyond the alleviation of personal troubles. Our untapped inner resources are also essential to the flowering of our greatest potentials, to the actualization of our true selves, and to the embodiment of the life of our very souls. These natural faculties are what we must cultivate in order to actively protect and restore our planet's ecosystems and to spark the urgently needed renaissance of our Western and Westernized cultures. And these innate human resources are precisely those that enable each of us to identify the unique genius and hidden treasure we carry for the world, and in this way to participate fully and consciously in the evolution of life on Earth. These resources, which I call the four facets of the self, or the four dimensions of our human wholeness, wait within us, but we might not even know they exist until we discover how to access them, cultivate their powers, and integrate them into our everyday lives. Reclaiming these essential human capacities of the self ought to be the highest priority in psychology, education, religion, medicine, and leadership development. Doing so empowers people to wake up, rise up, and become genuine agents of cultural transformation, and in the bargain, experience the most profound fulfillment of a lifetime. The recognition and embrace of these inherent human strengths, capacities, and sensibilities turn much of Western psychology on its head. Our entire approach to understanding and quickening human potential and addressing personal problems shifts radically. For example, many of the behavioral patterns that mainstream psychology labels as psychopathologies, such as anxiety, depression, manias, phobias, personality disorders, and the tendency to hear or see things other people don't, are not necessarily problems in themselves. How do we know when they are and when they're not? What if most actual pathologies are primarily symptoms of underdeveloped psychological resources, inborn capacities of the self that await cultivation within everyone? Psychological symptoms may best be relieved not by directly trying to eradicate them, impede them, or mask them, but rather by developing our innate resources, the unavailability of which may be the primary reason these symptoms appeared in the first place. Perhaps we exhibit psychological symptoms not so much because we're disordered, but because we're deficient in our embodiment of wellness, health, or wholeness. When we eliminate symptoms without cultivating wholeness, we still have an unwell, unwhole, or fragmented psyche that will soon enough sprout new symptoms that express in yet another way the lack of wholeness. Here's an analogy from ecology. When an ecosystem has been damaged, say from logging, overgrazing, or chemical-dependent monocrop agriculture, and then you leave it alone, invasive species typically show up and take over. If you then attempt to simply suppress or eliminate the invasives, whether through pesticide application or heroic weeding, you're not strengthening the ecosystem, but rather merely suppressing a symptom called weeds. In contrast, if you tend the health of the ecosystem, for example, by improving soil quality or planting native species, the invasives find a less suitable landing site, and the ecosystem is more quickly restored to its natural and mature wholeness. Likewise, when we tend the well-being of our human psyches by improving our social and ecological soil and cultivating the native species of the self, there is less opportunity for the fragmented or wounded elements of our psyches to take over. The psychological space is already occupied by the facets of a more fully flourishing being. We've placed the emphasis on promoting health and wholeness rather than on merely suppressing pathology and fragmentedness. We can douse our psyches with pharmaceutical pesticides and therapeutically weed them, but a much better approach would be to enhance our psychological, cultural, and ecological soil, and to cultivate the capacities of our native human wholeness. A second limiting assumption of conventional Western psychology, in addition to the idea that the symptom is the problem rather than an indication of a problem, is that our difficulties are solely or primarily a result of troubles within individual psyches, or even worse, within individual brains. But in recent decades, we've come to understand that our psychological health relies profoundly on the health of the world in which we are embedded, the psychosocial well-being of our families, the maturity and diversity of our human communities, and the vitality of our natural environments. Indeed, the very meaning of the phrase psychological health is interpersonal and ecological, and cannot be coherently reduced to something merely subjective, internal, or neurological. Behavioral patterns that some might perceive as psychological disorders are often understandable and natural reactions to a disordered world. Most personal difficulties are symptoms of problems in our relationships, families, societies, and ecosystems. When a large proportion of people in a given culture have significant psychological troubles, as is demonstrably the case in the Western world today, these people are not to blame. Their culture is. And yet, their culture is constituted by the collective actions of its members. It is the responsibility of all capable individuals to help make their culture whole and vital. Those who are most capable in this way are those who are most whole in themselves. How can we most effectively grow whole and participate in the revitalization of the whole? This book offers an answer. In this book, I introduce a map of psychological wholeness, a map that is non-arbitrary and comprehensive precisely because it's rooted in nature's own map of wholeness. The nature-based map of the psyche serves as a guide to becoming fully human by cultivating the four facets of the self and discovering both the limitations and the gifts of our wounded, fragmented, and shadowed subpersonalities. This map of the psyche has been in development since the 1980s and has been field-tested and refined by psychologists, counselors, life coaches, educators, clergy, parents, initiation guides, and leaders of wilderness rites in their work with thousands of people of all ages. For those of you who are psychotherapists, philosophers, professionals in another related field, or simply interested in learning more, I've used this book's endnotes primarily for ideas and references that may be of particular interest to you, and also see the website wildmindbook.com, especially for the page for professionals. Rewilding psychology. Beyond its focus on pathology rather than possibility and participation, another feature of conventional Western psychology that renders it incomplete and largely obsolete is that, like mainstream Western culture more generally, it is alienated from the greater Earth community, especially from nature's untamed powers, qualities, species, and habitats. This is a core insight of the developing field of eco-psychology. What makes us human is not merely other humans. We evolved over millennia in response to the challenges and opportunities encountered within a wildly complex web of ecological relationships in a thoroughly animate world. The ways we think, feel, perceive, imagine, and act have arisen in attunement to the rhythms of the day and the turning of the seasons, and in intimate relationship with myriad other life forms and forces. Although in everyday Western life we might feel cut off from our wild earthly roots and relationships, it nevertheless remains true that the deep structures of our human psyche, the underlying patterns, universal archetypes, innate capacities available to us all, And yes, even the distinctive ways we are psychologically wounded and fragmented have emerged from this living web. What insights, then, about our human psyches appear when we return to Earth, when we remember that we are related to everything that has ever existed, when we reinstall ourselves in a world of spring, summer, fall, winter, volcanoes, storms, surf, bison, mycelium, moons, falcons, sand dunes, galaxies, and redwood groves? What do we discover about ourselves when we consent again to being human animals, bipedal, omnivorous mammals with distinctive capacities for self-reflexive consciousness, dexterity, imagination, and speech? In what ways will we choose to live when we fully remember the naturalness and ecological necessity of death? Who will we see in the mirror when we face up to the present-day realities of human-caused mass extinction, ecosystem collapse, and climate destabilization? And what mystery journey will unfold when we answer the alluring and dangerous summons now emanating from the human soul, from the dream of the earth, and from an intelligent, evolving, ensouled universe? Beyond insights into the nature of our humanity, what will we discover or remember about the most effective methods for cultivating our human wholeness once we liberate psychotherapy, coaching, education, and religion from indoor consulting rooms, classrooms, and churches? What happens when we rewild our techniques and practices for facilitating human development, not by merely getting them out the door and onto the land or waters, but much more significantly by fashioning approaches in which our encounters with the other-than-human world are the central feature? What happens, in other words, when we allow nature itself to be the primary therapist or guide, while the human mentor or advisor becomes more of an assistant to nature, an agent or handmaiden of the wild? We have a vital opportunity now to shape a new Western psychology that acknowledges humanity as first and foremost natural, of nature, not separate from it. It's time to rewild psychology with ideas and methods rooted in the rhythms, patterns, principles, and other-than-human encounters of greater nature. We seek a Western psychology firmly planted in both wild soil and the soul of the world, at once both an eco-psychology and a depth psychology, one that emboldens us to serve the greater Earth community and to enhance the life of all species, and that does not merely tempt us to use nature for our own healing, self-centered benefit, or egocentric profit. A mature ecotherapy does not attempt to decrease our anxiety, outrage, fear, grief, or despair in response to the ongoing industrial destruction of the biosphere. Rather, it helps us to more fully experience these feelings so that we can revitalize ourselves emotionally, and in doing so, enable our greatest contributions to a cultural renaissance. This is our current collective human adventure, which theologian and cultural historian Thomas Berry calls the great work of our time, to carry out the transition from a period of human devastation of the earth to a period when humans would be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner. It is what eco-philosopher Joanna Macy refers to as the Great Turning, the transition from a doomed economy of industrial growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the recovery of our world. The great work of our time calls us to something greater than personal happiness, and something more than mere refinements in politics, economy, religion, and education. At its most fundamental level, the great work necessitates both a revolution in our understanding of what it is to be human and a revival of our abilities to realize our potential and to transform our contemporary cultures. It's time, then, to redraw our map of the human psyche, a revision germinated not in notions of symptoms and illness, but in our innate wholeness and our foundational and organic embedment in the natural world. Toward these ends, this book introduces a holistic and integral ecology of the human psyche that encompasses the best insights of existing Western psychologies, but also stretches far beyond them, extending our appreciation of the psyche's untapped potentials and its inner diversity, intricacy, and structural elegance. The nature-based map of the psyche highlights our positive life-enhancing resources and perspectives, and extols them as foundational to our humanity. The accent is not on our fragmented parts or wound stories, or how our psyches stall out neurotic patterns, or how we might merely recover from trauma, pathology, or addiction. Rather, the accent is on our wholeness and potential magnificence, how we can enhance our personal fulfillment and participation in our more-than-human world, and how we can become fully human and visionary artisans of cultural renaissance. Chapter 1. The Nature-Based Map of the Human Psyche. An Overview. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. Human beings came out of that wholeness. Gary Snyder. Wisdom traditions from around the world, including those from which Western cultures emerged, have looked to nature's 7 directions for a model of wholeness: north, south, east, west, up, down, and center. These 7 directions support us in fathoming the wholeness of, well, anything that came out of the original wholeness called nature or wilderness, the wholeness that human beings came out of, as poet Gary Snyder reminds us. My approach to constructing a comprehensive nature-based map of the human psyche begins with a foundational 3-dimensional pattern of the 7 directions. Here's how I've mapped the psyche onto nature's framework. The horizontal plane. The self. In the 4 cardinal directions are the 4 facets of our innate human potential, the 4 sets of resources that make up our horizontal psychological wholeness. Together, these 4 facets constitute what I call the self. As we'll see in later chapters, they also reflect the qualities of the natural world we observe in the 4 directions, and not coincidentally, the characteristics of the 4 seasons and the 4 times of day: dawn, noon, dusk, and midnight. Subpersonalities. Because each aspect of wholeness also has its immature form, we also find in the cardinal directions the 4 categories of our fragmented or wounded parts, which I call subpersonalities, and sometimes just subs for short, again echoing the qualities of the 4 directions, seasons, and times of day. The vertical axis. Spirit. In the upward direction is the dimension of the human psyche that identifies with spirit, also known as God, mystery, or the non-dual. The upward direction is also known as the upper world, the heavens, or the vast reaches of the cosmos. Soul. Reaching down into depths, we find the human soul, our unique and deepest individual identity. The downward direction is also known as the underworld, Hades, or the fruitful darkness. The center. The ego. In the center, at the intersection of the horizontal and the vertical, is the ego. Its home, or natural habitat, is the everyday world, or middle world, of family, social, economic, educational, political, and ecological life. In our 3-dimensional wholeness, each one of us is nature in human form, nature in its wholeness of the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 seasons, and the 4 times of day, and also of the upper world, underworld, and middle world. Definitions. Soul, spirit, self, and ego. Why all the capitalized words, you might ask? Simply to remind you throughout this book that I'm using these common words to refer to aspects of psyche defined in specific and not necessarily common ways. Here, then, are my definitions of these and other key components of the nature-based map of the human psyche. Soul. The soul is a person's unique purpose or identity, a mytho-poetic identity, something much deeper than personality or social vocational role. An identity revealed and expressed through symbol and metaphor, image and dream, archetype and myth. Some other ways to say this. Soul is the particular ecological niche or place a person was born to occupy, but may or may not ever discover or consciously embody. Or, in a more poetic vein, soul is the largest conversation you're capable of having with the world. It's your own truth at the center of the image you were born with. It's the shape that waits in the seed of you to grow and spread its branches against a future sky, or it's your individual puzzle piece in the great mystery. For example, the soul of Irish poet William Butler Yeats can be articulated by way of a poem he wrote and an experience he had in his late 20s, as the niche of one who plucks the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Eco-philosopher, Buddhist, and Earth Elder Joanna Macy, at age 37, experienced a life-transforming inner image of a stone bridge that spanned between the thought worlds of East and West, connecting the insights of the Buddha Dharma with the modern Western mind. She knew in that moment that her destiny was in part to be one of the stones in that bridge. Just one, that was enough. And it might be said that cultural historian Thomas Berry was ensouled as someone who preserves and enhances wildness and the natural cycles of its transformation, and who perceives, articulates, and advocates the dream of the earth. Spirit. Spirit, or God, mystery, or the non-dual, is the universal consciousness, intelligence, psyche, or vast imagination that animates the cosmos and everything in it, including us, and in which the psyche of each person participates. When consciously attuned to spirit, we experience a profound connectedness with all things, the oneness of spirit. The manner in which spirit manifests itself or unfolds has been called, to cite just 3 examples, evolution's trajectory, the Tao, the way of life, or the universe story. Self. The self is an integral whole, a bundle of innate resources every human has in common, a totality that holds all the original capacities of our core humanness. The self incorporates the 4 facets of our horizontal human wholeness, which exist at birth but only as possibilities that, like the soul, we may or may not learn to access, actualize, and embody. These 4 facets can be described in terms of archetypes, universal patterns of human behavior and character found in all cultures, and in myths, dreams, art, and literature. The self contains all the resources we need to meaningfully contribute to our more than human, which means not merely human world, in order to live a mature, fulfilling, creative human life, to effectively manifest our soul's desires, and to align ourselves with spirit's unfolding. In this book, I use self and horizontal human wholeness interchangeably. Subpersonalities. The subpersonalities are the wounded and sometimes hidden fragments of our human psyches, such as our inner victim, rebel, critic, tyrant, or addict, each of which attempts to protect us from further injury. These are constellations of feelings, images, and behaviors that operate more or less independently from one another and often independently of our conscious selves, egos. Subpersonalities form in childhood, with the enduring purpose of protecting us from physical, psychological, and social harm. Often they succeed. Often they also create additional troubles or mischief for us and others. Our subpersonalities are the source or instigators of what Western psychology understands to be our psychological symptoms and illnesses. I borrowed the term subpersonalities from the approach to psychology known as psychosynthesis, developed by Italian psychiatrist Roberto Assagioli in the early 1900s. Other traditions and schools of Western psychology have referred to intrapsychic fragments of this sort as complexes, Freudian and Jungian analysis, parts, Gestalt psychology, internal objects, object relations theory, ego states, transactional analysis, or selves, Hal and Sidra Stone's voice dialogue or psychology of selves, and Richard Schwartz's internal family systems therapy. Each subpersonality functions by way of an interrelated set of ideas, emotions, memories, impulses, and behavioral patterns. Ego. The ego is the locus or seat of conscious self-awareness within the human psyche, the I. I also use another term, the three-dimensional ego or 3D ego, to refer to an ego blessed with some degree of conscious communion and integration with self, soul, and spirit. By personality, I mean the characteristic patterns of behavior the ego engages in. How the ego operates. When awake, we, our egos, can in principle be conscious through the frame of reference of any of the other 4 aspects of the psyche, namely the self, soul, spirit, or subpersonalities. This is to say that we can be conscious as, and act from the perspective of, any one of these 4 aspects of the psyche. But the subpersonalities are the default position for our egos. Unless and until we cultivate conscious relationships with self, soul, and spirit, and in that way function, at least at times, as 3D egos, we experience and behave by way of our psyche's fragmented or wounded parts, from the perspective, for example, of our conformist, escapist, or victim. With a healthy, mature 3D ego, we are fully anchored in the fourfold self, and we more often than not experience ourselves as being in the service to soul, and consequently to spirit too. As 3D egos, we can also at times experience ourselves as soul or as spirit. Self and subpersonalities are not entities or little people inside people. A better way to think of them is as different versions of ourselves that we experience and enact at different times. Here's a slogan to help remember this. Self and subpersonalities don't do anything. People do. People often act by way of, or by means of, or through their subs, for example, and sometimes they're conscious that they're doing this.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?